Today I'm joined by Dr. Abhinav Gautam. We're going to be discussing some issues that could come up with Jayson Tatum once he's back on the floor, along with some of the often under expected risks that could also arise once he's back on the floor. Abby has worked with previous NBA stars as well as other sports stars from around different leagues in getting rehab and pain management. So, Abby, I just wanted to start there and just kind of go into your background and get a taste of like the experience and expertise that you can bring.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm an anesthesiologist by training, live between Miami and New York. Was a athlete my whole life until injury kind of derailed my own, professional ambitions. So I found myself then in medicine. And after I finished anesthesiology, I really because kind of was more of an entrepreneur, was involved in a couple software projects. And then after those, turned my attention back to regenerative medicine and trying to solve problems that not only affected me, but also affect everyone else, which was how can we optimize the body's musculoskeletal system to help us heal faster and or prevent injuries from even happening. So, I've been fortunate over the last several years to have worked with, some of the top athletes in the world from a variety of different sports, whether it's golf or basketball or baseball or football or even professional soccer. And, excited now that we have our clinic called Nuoro Wellness. And our main investor there is a fellow by the name of Todd Bole. And he's one of the owners of Chelsea Football Club, LA Lakers, and the LA Dodgers. So, you know, um, the focus is just on ending the suffering or reducing the suffering in the world. And, fortunately for us, we're able to work with a lot of pro athletes.
Todd Bowley, I'm out in the UK by
Yeah.
birth. Unfortunately, I mean, it's not the worst place to be. So Todd Bowley's a name I'm very familiar with just because he's in the news a lot now because
Yeah.
of obviously what he's doing with Chelsea. So that obviously working with him and having him being one of your primary investors also gives you kind of that access to the stars that need the help as well. So it's kind of a
hmm
symbiotic relationship there.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. He's been a patient as kind of in my life. Most people that I end up doing business with are the relationship starts as a patient. So, he was a patient, and then he, as a visionary, kind of really got what I was doing, and then really kind of backed it and is supporting us now. And obviously, to your point, is opening incredible doors and opportunities for us.
And that kind of leads me into just the experience that you will have and will continue to build on Achilles recoveries. I'm assuming that in the field that
hmm
you're in, you've dealt with Achilles recoveries or pain management upon returning from Achilles
hmm
with other stars around the league. And obviously, the whole
hmm
point of this conversation is to lead on to Jayson Tatum's
hmm
quote unquote impending return that none of us know if it's going to happen, but eventually
hmm
he will be back.
hmm
So I kind of want to segue there, and obviously I don't like I never expect you to use names. If we just use patient A, patient B,
Yeah,
and
sure.
just to build from that experience there in when a player first comes back from an Achilles. In fact, let me start here. Jayson Tatum had his Achilles surgery a day after the injury occurred. So it
Yeah.
occurred, and then what does that do in terms of the timeline and the benefits? As opposed to maybe waiting a week before going in for surgery or waiting 2 or 3 days. What is the upside there?
Yeah, sure. So good question. So the main antagonist or enemy to maximal human performance as it relates to injury is scar tissue formation, right? And the body is this divine intelligent being, it doesn't matter what religion you ascribe to, it's this magical, system that's actually capable of self-healing. Now the problem is that certain types of injuries the body can't heal itself in a way that would be, let's say, regenerative, right? So then it heals in the only way it knows how to, which is by creating scar tissue. There's been a trend now in orthopedics where you're trying to operate on people as quickly as you can to minimize that distortion of anatomy, right? And minimize the scar tissue that's forming immediately. And the whole idea is to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again as quickly as possible, and then get Humpty Dumpty moving as quickly as possible, right? So the Achilles is maybe a little different than like a knee replacement, but the analogy is kind of the same. Let's just take a knee replacement, right? A knee replacement happens. They're now aggressively trying to get these people to start moving their knees as quickly as possible, even kind of getting up and trying to walk, day 1, day 2, day 3, because the literature is saying that, right, the less a person is moving around after an injury, the more likely scar tissue is going to form. The more likely scar tissue is going to form, the more likely you're going to have problems downstream. The Achilles is a different structure. If you want me to, I can just kind of quickly go into a little bit about, what the Achilles tendon is, right? So for the Achilles, the fascia matters very significantly because the tendon is functioning as part of this elastic load sharing system, right? So that elastic load sharing starts at the plantar fascia, which originates under the foot. And then this is going up through the calf and into what's called the posterior chain. So a way of thinking about this is that the Achilles is the cable, but the fascia is the tensioning system that helps distribute the force and restore the spring, right? And in basketball specifically, it's all about the elastic explosion that you're able to elicit, right? Whenever you're engaging your leg, right? So you can put the tendon back together, but the million dollar question for every athlete is, well, okay, now that the tendon has been put back together, but am I going to return to the same level of explosiveness that I had before, right? And that's the main thing, right? So as it relates to healing, that's going to be the number one goal for these folks.
So once the healing process starts, you obviously
Yeah.
you get the surgery straight away or as
Hmm.
quickly as possible. You get back on your feet as quickly as possible, and then
Yeah.
as we've seen, like Jayson Tatum specifically over the last few months, there's been incremental increases in workload from lifting weights to then jogging, sprinting, and obviously there's a progression there that it has been well documented in his instance, but is
Hmm.
clearly kind of across everybody making the recovery. At what point do you start to stress test that Achilles in terms of like, is there more concern when you're moving laterally at pace? Is there more concern in terms of exploding off that foot for a leaping ability? Or where does your concern come both during the rehab and then once you're back on the floor? Where are the I don't want to call them pressure points because that's kind of the wrong
Yeah.
word, but like the areas of concern where you're like, these areas are going to be something that he needs to continue to develop and work on for the next X amount of months before his confidence in that area can be fully back to 100%.
Okay, great question. So why don't we frame it into like 3 buckets? So let's talk about like, okay, so how are we assessing if any player's Achilles and their fascia are ready to be performing optimally again? So there's kind of 3 buckets, right? Bucket number 1 is the tissue readiness. So that's at a local level. So making sure that there's no reactive swelling, pain-free progressive loading of force. Then you're looking at like the restored calf capacity, right? So what's the end range strength and the endurance? And then what's the tendon tolerance to repeated elastic demand? So that's bucket number 1. Bucket number 2 is the system, like the readiness on like a systematic level, right? So that's the fascial plus kinetic change. So that's looking at what's the symmetry in shock absorption and push off, right? What's the force transfer between the ankle and the hip to make sure that, we call it stealing from the hip and the knees, meaning if you're right, because everything is interconnected. So if there's an issue with the Achilles in terms of load distribution and elastic recoil, then what you may have is you may find the hip and the knee are compensating for the Achilles, and then that can result in not only suboptimal biomechanical return, but then also potentially increased injury risk for different body parts, right? And then the sports readiness for the NBA specifically is how is his multi-directional deceleration to then reacceleration, right? And then looking at how is the single leg landing mechanics. That's a huge issue in basketball, right? And then making sure that that's fatigue proofing, right? Because he may be able to do that for 3 or 4 reps, but under an actual, under the bright lights and the pressures of a game, you don't want that leg to be fatigued in the fourth quarter. So a simple way of thinking about it is that they're not going to just be checking for strength, but they're going to be checking for whether the whole kind of elastic system is back, right? The data suggests typically that players usually return from, 10 to 11 months after surgical repair. Again, I don't know exactly what kind of repair he had, but being one of the top players in the NBA, we know, especially now, and I think Kobe was really the first to create this. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of flu here. First to create, this recovery archetype of throwing everything at the kitchen sink. I don't know if you remember that documentary where after the surgery, one of the things was very aggressive myofascial scraping, right? So where they're taking that kind of metal tool and they're scraping along that surgical site because they're trying to smooth out that tissue, right? I guess to use my napkin, if it's supposed to look like this, like a flat sheet, but now there's like crumples in it, you know, the right, it's going to be less efficient, and that distortion in the anatomy, it can increase the risk of tearing it again, can make it less strong, right, less elastic, etc. So they're going to be doing everything for this guy, just like KD. I think the difference between like KD and Tatum is like their playing styles, right? KD is more of kind of like a smooth operator from the outside. He's already 7 feet tall, so he doesn't have to even jump that high to kind of get a shot off. Tatum's kind of a more explosive player, especially at this stage of his career. So there's going to be even more of a focus for him to kind of get back to his playing style. Now we don't know if he's going to have to alter his style right at the beginning, right, to work around that injury. One thing I can tell you, and maybe you've had injuries yourself, is whenever you get injured, once you've healed and once you've been cleared, the biggest component then I found in taking care of a lot of these men and women is the psychological component, right? So very difficult to play free if you're massively concerned about injuring your leg in basketball. You're just not, like your mind is, you're not going to get in that flow state. And flow state for any of us is when you just zone out, like nothing else matters, and you just kind of become completely 1000% present in whatever it is you're doing. And it's hard to be present in anything that you're doing when you're in pain or you have doubts about your health. I mean, the same thing goes for you or I, right? It'd be tough for you to be present doing this interview if you had burning pain shooting down your right leg, from sciatica or something. Or for me, if I had a chronic migraine from some neck problem, it would be tough for me to totally be here. So I think that same analogy holds true. I mean, athletes are human beings just like us. We kind of put them on a pedestal because they're doing these amazing physical things, within these constrained environments. But it amplifies even more the same issues that you and I or any of our listeners deal with, right? Which is, it's tough to be totally present when you are distracted by a health problem, right? There's that Chinese saying, a healthy man has 1,000 dreams, a sick man only has one, right? And the one that the sick man has is to feel better. So I don't know if that answers that question.
More than, because then, and you even answered the next one, which was about that mental hurdle.
Yeah.
One of the things I've wrote about probably extensively at this point is learning to trust your body again.
Yes.
Just in the concept of Tatum, of that first drive to the rim is going to be so important in just proving to himself that he's
Mm-hmm.
able to withstand the pressure, able to change direct. Whatever his body needs to do, it can withstand.
Mm-hmm.
The other concern that I have, just in specific, like from a fan and slash analyst, however you want to frame me as a
Mm-hmm.
standpoint, is the post NBA boost, like the post NBA return injury concern, in terms of you. There's so much not literally, so many interviews from NBA players and sports stars, whether it be EPL, NFL, NHL, where and again, if you've ever done a sport like it, all what you know, that you can train to your heart's content, but you can never replicate game speed, right? Like
Absolutely.
I've done a lot of
1,000%.
combat sports throughout my life, and you can run. Like running is huge, obviously for cardio, but once you're in the
Mm-hmm.
ring or you're in the cage and the adrenaline dump occurs, nothing prepares you for having to push
Absolutely.
through. So in specific for like Tatum or any player, I mean, there's a bunch of players out right now with ACLs, not ACL, sorry, Achilles. You got Tyrese Halliburton, Damian Lillard. For any of these guys returning, what are and I know that you've kind of mentioned how important the fascia is within
Mm-hmm.
the Achilles system.
Mm-hmm.
What concern would fascia plantitis or any other injury like that? or sorry, I wouldn't call it an injury, or would you? Anyway, would that be over a 10, 20, 30 game sample size? Is that an ailment that they could then start to have to navigate, if that makes sense?
Oh, okay. So are you kind of asking about what could happen, what else could happen to their body, like while they're
Exactly, yeah.
navigating? Okay,
Once you're
yeah.
back at game speed and
Yeah.
now you're putting your body under this like extreme amount of physical stress for
Yeah.
prolonged periods of time,
Yeah.
are you prone to kind of a bit of overcompensation or a little bit of reactiveness from your body leading to new ailments that you now need to
That's so
navigate?
so that's a great question. And I think, because the entire body is connected, and we'll just kind of look at from the foot to the hip, because that's basically, you know, everything that's encompassing what we're talking about. The things that, let's say, these players or anyone, but let's say, for the for the purpose of the NBA discussion. So the things that NBA players can do to proactively maintain this fascial health to reduce further injury or injuries in other body parts are a couple things, right? So if you've been out for 9 months, obviously that leg, that calf, that ankle is going to be weaker and less stable than the other one, right? Or than it was before. So you're going to need to do a lot of like eccentric and isometric calf work, right? And that's going to help manage like the tendons capacity, you know, uh, you the foot and ankle stiffness and mobility balance, right? So you're going to need to do a lot of kind of specific foot and ankle rehab. The posterior chain, and when I say posterior chain, there's a concept that was made famous by this guy Tom Myers, and it's called anatomy trains, and it was actually one of the most impactful books I've ever read in terms of helping me understand the fascial system and how the entire body is connected and how it works together. So there are these different kind of almost like, if you think about like these carbon fiber sheets of fascia that are connected, all over your body, right? And the posterior chain is one that kind of starts in the back of your head and goes all the way down like the back of your calf into your plantar fascia. Okay. And there, so there's a connection from your hamstrings to your hips to then your Achilles. So you're going to want to basically really strengthen and make sure that you have all the proprioception back in that leg for you to fully trust it, right? Or for any of these guys to fully trust it. And I think that that's only really possible if biomechanically you've optimized yourself as close to your pre-injury as you can. And obviously that's easier said than done. But again, what's Achilles surgery really hasn't, there was a new innovation in this anchor surgery. I don't know what kind of surgery he had, right? Before they just used to, it tears and then they like sew it back together, right? Now they have a new surgery where they, instead of sewing it here, they kind of run some stitches, pull it back together, and then bring those stitches down and anchor them in the back of the heel. So the thought there is that it causes less disturbance to the actual the physical, the physical orientation of these fibers, right? Because if things are supposed to be perfectly parallel when they're working 100%, now they tear, and now a human being is sewing them back together. I mean, right? Like it's never going to be 100% back to normal. And where you're sewing them back together, you usually feel and even see like a bit of scar, right? Like imagine if you sew like two pieces of fabric back together, right? There's going to be like a little bulge here, right? What's also interesting is that, what are you actually, I'll send you some stuff after, but when you look at the anatomy of the Achilles, we're talking about millimeter windows between the bone to the Achilles and then to the fascia that sits above the Achilles to then the skin. What I have seen, in the cases that I've done, is that people with Achilles tendinopathies, or let's say problems with the Achilles, before surgery or after surgery, typically what you see is a distortion of those very fine, precise anatomical layers. So what do I mean by that? If again, we look at this napkin, right? And let's say each layer of the napkin is one of these layers of tissue. So let's say this is the fascia and then this part is the Achilles. Ordinarily, they're supposed to be able to move over one another. When problems start happening is when these layers start getting stuck together, right? The more stuck together those layers of tissue are, the stiffer they are. The stiffer they are, just like in like jujitsu, right? Like the stiffer or less flexible you are, the higher probability you're going to get injured when you're rolling, right? Or, you get put into a compromised position, you may tear your shoulder, right? Because you don't have the flexibility that, let's say, Mikey Musumeci, right? Or one of these like hyper flexible jujitsu guys have, right? So they can like get out of these problems. So it's the same thing with the Achilles, right? As that structure starts to get more and more stuck together and stiff, you start to lose that elasticity. And the elasticity is flexibility. And that's like the name of the game, right? Like the more elastic you are, it's like a rubber band. You can take a rubber band and stretch it and it comes back. That's kind of ideally what the tendon should be doing. If you lay out a rubber band in the sun for a day and then it gets really dry and brittle, you try to stretch it out. Yeah, exactly. Like it may not come back. Exactly.
Again, this can associate with anyone that's had an Achilles surgery or any muscular surgery, to be honest. There was an image of Tatum that came out last week, and he was working out in the gym, and then he was doing some 5-on-5. And obviously, the leg that had suffered the Achilles tear was noticeably smaller than the leg
Yeah.
that hadn't. Is that something that there will always be that way now? Will one leg always be slightly smaller, slightly less muscular, slightly less defined? Is that kind of, oh, you've torn an Achilles, so now your leg will only be at 90% for the rest of
Yeah.
your life, as opposed to the 100% it was pre-injury?
So that's a great question. Again, I don't know the extent of his injury. Did he have any soleus involvement, which is like that deep muscle of the calf that sits underneath the calf muscles that kind of runs down, and then the Achilles is running over it. I didn't see the photo, but I think the question is, we don't know. Logically thinking, if you are used to like doing bicep curls with both arms, and then all of a sudden now you're not doing bicep curls with your right arm, but you still do them with your left, you probably will have a strength disparity. So I hope for his sake that it comes back. Kind of to my point earlier, I think the thing that's different about surgery recovery now, the surgeries haven't evolved that much, but everything else around the surgery, specifically like recovery, and let's say regenerative medicine, like that, like these things are evolving at like rapid speed, right? So it's probably, a reasonable thought to think that, he's been doing red light therapy on the Achilles. He's been doing maybe even what's called PEMF, right? Which is pulsed electromagnetic frequency, which basically oscillates magnets on off on off on off, and that's been shown to rapidly or to substantially improve healing from bone fractures to even soft tissue injuries, right? Because it's increasing blood flow, it's increasing the lymphatic flow, it's increasing cellular nutrition. So it's, he's doing all these things, right? Like he's probably getting therapy multiple times a day, right? Cold plunging, like everything, like myofascial scraping, right? Like 20 years ago, these things weren't really a thing, right? Now recovery, like every NBA player, probably most of them have a Whoop strap, like they're probably tracking, they may be using a amortal recovery bed, right? They may be doing, like a variety of things. But I think we have confidence in a player is like an asset to these teams, specifically in baseball, soccer, and basketball, where you have guaranteed contracts, right? The NFL is a little more cutthroat. But in these where you have assets that are guaranteed money, right? It's in not only the player's best interest, but also the team's alignment to get these people back to play as quickly as possible. Sometimes there's a bit of disagreement with maybe the team wants them to come back sooner than they're ready, kind of like Kawhi, right? Like that happened to Kawhi for like, there was like a couple of years, right? When he had those deep bruises in his thighs and didn't show up really on MRI. So the Spurs said that like, like you should be playing. And he's like, I still don't feel ready, so there was like a deep disagreement there. I think from Tatum's perspective, look, he's in Boston. There's a lot of great doctors around there, right? In the Harvard system. I'm sure he's getting the best care he can. There's no reason, like they're number 2, at least last I looked, right? Like I think they're second in the East. You can say that they're doing pretty well without him. Obviously they'd be much better with him, but like if you're if you're both the organization and the player, like why would you risk returning too soon if you're already pretty competitive, you know?
This leads
And
me to the main question that I kind of wanted to lead us out with was,
sure.
what is the value of a longer term recovery rather? So there's been a huge debate within like the Celtics fan base of whether or
Yeah.
not it's beneficial for Tatum to return the moment he's cleared by the physicians. So your doctors have cleared you, the medical staff have cleared you. You are now, by all accounts, cleared to return to the basketball court. And say it's been 10 months, 10.5 months, 11 months.
Yeah.
What is the value there versus actually waiting until the start of the new season in October, where we're now bordering on 15, 16 months
Yeah.
around that? Is there any physiological benefit to the extended period before you make that return? Does it change anything physiologically?
You know, it's hard to say because it's not like he's incapacitated, not doing anything, right? Like he's still, you know, like he's probably more focused on this body part than he ever has been before. So there could be a situation where he comes back stronger from the injury. You know, I think here are the things, right? So like we know that he's been doing these full 5-on-5 scrimmages, you know, but there's also been some reporting that, you know, he wants to like get this right. Right. So the risks of, so from a fan's perspective, what are the risks of him returning too early? So that could be a re-rupture, which is rare, but that obviously would be catastrophic. Right. There could be persistent tendinopathy, which basically means like inflammation or irritation of the tendon from underprepared load tolerance, meaning you kind of come back too soon and now you're overexerting yourself and now the tendon is like inflamed and that now you've taken several steps backwards. You can have secondary injuries, right? So that could be from a hamstring, a hip, a knee, or that could be the other leg, right? And then also there's like a potential performance ceiling that's reduced, meaning like he doesn't return to the same level that he was because the elasticity hasn't fully been restored. So basically, like the biggest risk to coming back too early isn't just the Achilles, but it's the compensation injuries that happen, you know, if the system isn't ready. And again, like you know, I don't know what I don't know, right? Which is a lot about his specific situation. To me, if I was like a GM or in his camp, it basically would be, you know, as long as we're playing well and are competitive, my focus would be making sure you're ready to go towards the very end of the season, start of the playoffs. Because at the end of the day, like that's, I don't want to say the games aren't important, but like that's what these guys are playing for, you know? Like, does he need to win 20 more games in the regular season? Like that won't impact his legacy, you know, but like another deep playoff run or a championship obviously would be profoundly beneficial.
So the narrative there, I should say, and it's to certainly a fan built narrative, not a like an educatedly built narrative from
Mm-hmm.
doctors is kind of where I'm going with that. Not saying fans aren't educated, just from somebody with a medical background like yourself, is the additional regular season games providing ramp up where he can kind of
Yeah,
be on a minutes restriction, test out how
exactly.
his body responds before the, you know, if you get thrown into the playoffs, a minutes restriction or not, you're being put in the most physical brand of basketball that's available as compared to the final 20 games of the regular season. Seeding's
Absolutely.
already set. Do you see the value there in kind of a ramp up, or do you feel like if he's cleared, if he's recovering okay in 5-on-5 behind the scenes, then his body should be able to adapt to
No, Adam, I think, you know, you hit it spot on. I mean, what you said earlier is 1000% accurate. There's never a, there's never a, you know, you can never substitute the pressure of like the real, like the game, right? Like the real world pressure, like the speed, et cetera, et cetera. So um ramp up is logical, like you have to, right? That's why I kind of alluded to it would make sense to kind of get going towards the end of the season. You ramp it up, you know, like if he's ready, my mind would be, you know, you start ramping up slowly, seeing how he's doing, right? And then make sure like you want to start peaking again for the playoffs, you know? And obviously fans want the players back as quickly as possible, but you know, the risk of rushing things too soon is not to be understated.
And with that, I just want to kind of round this out with like we've spoken at length now about your obviously your educated opinion on ACL, on Achilles, and the physiological and medical kind of concerns and benefits from
Hmm.
surgeries and wellnesses. Clearly, this is something you excel in. So I kind of wanted to wrap it up with, we spoke about how you kind of work with sports stars, and
Hmm.
obviously I don't know how many listeners here can are in your area, but do you only deal with sports stars, or are you
No, no,
kind?
no, no, no. Of course not. No, no, no. Look. We Our mission at Noro is to reduce the suffering in the world, right? So we don't only work with professional athletes. I think our patients typically are patients who really place a lot of value on their ability to move and perform at a high level, right? So we're not a doctor's office really that takes care of people that have gotten injured because they sit on the couch too much. You know what I mean? Like, it's usually people that are, maybe they're a black belt in jujitsu, right? Or a blue belt, right? Like a funny adage from combat sports, one of our staff that works at the clinic, right? She started doing jujitsu a couple years ago, does tournaments. I think now she's the blue belt. You know, through her journey, she's been injured several times, right? She then came to the clinic. Obviously, we took care of her, and then got her back on the mat. Our clinic, and for those that are listening, if you are interested in kind of accessing the most cutting edge regenerative medicine that's out there, then that's what we do, right? So we're either here to help people heal faster after their surgery, or in certain situations when surgery isn't indicated or they don't want surgery, they're seeking another alternative. If that clinical situation lines up, then we also treat those types of folks. So, like, I can't even think of how many people we treated from the Achilles, right? Lots of people in the NBA, MLB, NFL, also marathon runners, so it's pro athletes and it's also weekend warriors.
I mean, that's great because you just never know who's listening. It's like, I mean, I was
Yeah,
speaking to
absolutely.
somebody literally yesterday that tore their. I'll actually read out the message that he sent me because it was brutal. He was rolling in jiu-jitsu at the time,
Hmm.
and he did, let's have a look where it is. Torn meniscus, partially torn ACL, high grade MCL sprain, and then the torn meniscus has now been lodged in the joint. And there's hundreds of people out there, if not thousands, that
Oh,
are
well.
experiencing injuries like this every day. So hopefully, if anyone listening here is local or can travel and they're dealing with stuff like this, then maybe they've been introduced to somebody that can help in a more forward thinking way.
Yeah, so I'll kind of leave with this, right? So longevity is something that you're hearing and reading about all the time. You know, what we're doing at Nuoro is we are pioneering the world's first musculoskeletal based longevity membership and protocol. So we're all about maximizing the musculoskeletal system and the health of people's musculoskeletal system for their lifespan, right? So we believe that, if you're a 30-year-old but have such bad back pain that you can't get out of your chair, then you're kind of like an 80-year-old. So, like, what's your quality of life, right? Like, quality of life and really the longevity is determined by your ability to move, right? If you can't exercise, then you're probably going to ultimately have heart problems, right? Or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So everything that we're doing, and it's not just the treatment, maybe we can jump on a call another time to talk about how we're infusing AI and ultrasound technology to revolutionize the way sports teams are even evaluating and monitoring their players. So we have some really cool pilots going on with some of the biggest sports teams in the world right now.
I would be 100% down to have a deep dive on
Yeah,
that with you.
well, we can do another one and then we can do like a screen share and we can show you like how we've created technology that, like, for the Achilles, you scan somebody's Achilles and then the software will automatically analyze and like decode what that ultrasound looks like, right? Like, how stiff is the tissue, where nerves could be entrapped, where there's scarring, where there could be a tear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
Quantifying an ultrasound, basically.
that's right up my alley. I definitely enjoy
Sure.
speaking with you about that. For now, though, I just want to say thank you. When we come off the call, I just need like a minute while the
No problem.
upload happens. But thank you very much for coming on. Your expertise was going to be, well, will be very enjoyable for everybody listening and everybody reading afterwards. So I really appreciate you. Thank you.
No, thanks for the opportunity to talk. Appreciate it.